Okay, so we're with Emma in her early years, and she's, as I was saying, she's a romantic. She's so attracted to these romantic novels and these images, and even when her mother dies, it's the image of grief that becomes so important to her. This is on page 33 of it's part 6 of the, chapter 6 of part 1 in the Davis translation. When her mother died, she wept a great deal in the first few days. She had a memorial picture made for herself with the dead woman's hair, and in a letter she sent to Les Bertaux, the farm, full of sorrowful reflections on life, she asked to be buried in the same grave later. The good man thought she was ill and came to see her. Emma was inwardly satisfied to feel that she had, at her first attempt, reached this rare ideal of pallid lives which mediocre hearts will never attain. In other words, she's, even in grief for her mother's death, she's trying to act a part. She's trying to play a role, the role of a deep person. And so she allowed herself to slip into Lamartinian meanderings. Lamartine was a romantic poet, a great romantic poet, but Flaubert thought he was too full of milky fluids, he said. He was too full of sentimentality. And so Emma allowed herself to slip into Lamartinian meanderings, listening to harps on lakes, to the song of every dying swan, to the falling of every leaf, to pure virgins rising to heaven, and to the voice of the eternal speaking in the valleys. You get it, you get the picture. She's, even in grief, she's playing this romantic part. And then Emma became bored with this, did not want to admit it, continued out of habit, then out of vanity, and was at last surprised to find that she was at peace and that there was no more sadness in her heart than there were wrinkles on her forehead. So what Flaubert is setting up here is that Romanticism has infected this little girl. Romanticism will infect her so deeply that she will keep pursuing this ethereal goal. She won't get disillusioned, and so she will suffer. And as she suffers, so the novel teaches. So remember, she wanted to be married by torchlight. She wants to. She has images in her head of what it means to live a deep life, a life of passion, a life of engagement with the higher things. But her idea of the higher things is a cliche. And that's really the key for Flaubert, is when people think in his period, and certainly he would think it continues to be true. If he were alive today, he would see it today. When people think they are going beyond the commonplace, that's the time to really be suspicious, because when they go beyond the commonplace, they often do so with the most conventional modes. They go beyond the commonplace with the most conventional vehicles. And so they're cliche-ridden. And Flaubert loved to collect cliches, which for him were a sign of stupidity, a sign of the inability to think for oneself. So Emma had thought she was cured of illusions. It says on page 34, I can quote, by the time Charles first appeared at Les Bertaux, she thought that she was cured of illusions, Emma did, that she had nothing more to learn, no great emotions to look forward to. And then she marries Charles, and she really feels that maybe her life was going to change, but as with her mother's death, she soon gets bored with Charles. She got bored with grief. She marries Charles. She thinks life is going to be different. She's, going to go shopping. She's going to fill up her house with great things. She's going to feel passion. And then after a while, she starts looking at her husband and thinking, my goodness, is that all there is? And she feels the same boredom with Charles. And boredom will be something that Emma continually tries to keep at bay, and with more and more extreme behavior. So I keep saying now that Emma is romantic, and maybe I should spend a little time with you talking about what Romanticism was for Flaubert. What did it represent? It's important to see that Romanticism was a reaction against the Enlightenment. Romanticism emphasized the heart, emphasized the emotions, while the Enlightenment emphasized the intellect and emphasized rationality. And so the Romantics in the 1820s and 1830s and even into the 1840s were poets and painters and musicians and novelists who really tried to heighten feeling. That was a big part of the project, heighten feeling, and to show that it's not all about the intellect. Progress, making the world more of a home is not only about rationality. The Romantics emphasized the importance of the soul and of emotion. The Romantics also opposed the classical or the neoclassical. In other words, in the late 18th century and the early years of the 19th century, the classicism has made a big return. Everything should be smooth and balanced and ordered, the classicists said. And the Romantics say, no, we want turbulence. We want turbulence. We want fiery emotion and not just emotion. We want things out of balance because life is really, the guts of life are out of balance, and Romanticism should reflect that. They also were against formalism, any attempt to emphasize tight, formal categories to structure art, the Romantics would reject in favor of a more fluid approach. Another important thing that the Romantics reject, and this is especially important in England, is they reject utilitarianism. We will talk more about that next week when we talk about the background to Charles Darwin. But for our purposes this week, we just want important to understand that Romantics say that you can't just measure things by a calculus of pleasure. The calculus of pleasure will be something that the utilitarians use to say, is this action create more happiness for more people? Can we measure how much happiness is created or how much pleasure is attained? And the Romantics reject this mechanistic approach to happiness and to pleasure. They value emotion, the Romantics. They value conflict. They're interested in nature as a scene of turbulence. They value authenticity and a kind of deep honesty, expression of the soul, and in the arts, very importantly, Romantics will emphasize color, a much more vibrant color, as opposed to the controlled palette of classicism and neoclassicism. So I give you all that because for Flaubert, who's not a Romantic, but Flaubert is to Romanticism as Rousseau was to the Enlightenment. Flaubert is to Romanticism as Rousseau was to the Enlightenment. That is, Flaubert understands Romanticism inside out. He can write Romantic prose like nobody's business, but he rejects it. He rejects it. He thinks it leads to stupidity and cliche. Just like Rousseau understood the Enlightenment perfectly, but he rejected it ultimately because he thought it led to corruption and inauthenticity. So we're seeing a kind of what I sometimes call a reflexive take on Romanticism. Just like with Rousseau, we saw a reflexive take on the Enlightenment. So let's go back to Emma and her education early on. The most important part of that, after the marriage, of course, is the ball. Remember the great dance that she goes to with Charles. And she is overwhelmed. She's overwhelmed by the luxury of the nobleman's chateau. She is just blown away by the clothes, by the shoes, by the dancing. And she goes to Charles, of course. But Charles is, he's there and he's trying to understand the games that people are playing. And they're playing cards or they're gambling. And he just stands there looking and trying to figure out why did that guy win? Why did this guy win? And then he asks Emma about, should we dance? And she said, no, you don't know how to dance. You don't know how to dance. And she's so intrigued. She's so intrigued, not as Charles is to figure out the puzzle, but because for Emma, she imagines herself in it. She imagines herself part of this world of luxury, and she thinks of emotion, of beauty, of romance,
That's great. That's great. And he's watching the card game, trying to understand how it's played, and he's exhausted. Where she is going into the ladies' room and watching people put on their makeup, and she is enlivened. Like, holy moly, this is my fantasy of life. Because Emma is so gorgeous that some dude is going to come up and say, "Come on, let's dance." Whereas no one's asking Charles to play, right? No one's asking Charles to play. That's the story of Charles. He's the kind of guy no one ever asked to play. You'd be watching a kickball game out here, you know, and no one would say, "Hey, you want to play?" And whereas Emma's the kind of girl, kind of woman, that everybody always says, "Oh, do you want to come with us?" And she thinks, "Oh, you've recognized me. You found me because I'm discoverable." You know, there is that kind of, there's a funny confidence there too, right? A romantic confidence.
And of course, at the ball, someone does ask her to dance. She is quite beautiful. That's Flaubert keeps reminding us she is really beautiful. And some gentleman comes up and asks her to dance, and she is swept off her feet. She's twirling, and it is a combination of a dream and a reality. You know, she's suddenly not just swept off her feet by a guy, she's swept out of her normal life in this little town where she doesn't really have anything to do except look at the curtains, and you know, and suddenly she's at this ball, and everybody is attractive, and they're all know what they're doing, and because she's a great beauty, she's brought into the center of it, and she's just her life seems changed, and sometimes it does at a party. You know, you have the illusion that everything's going to be different, but then of course the party ends, and she's got to go back. She's got to go back, and I want to read you just from page 48 how the ball affected her. Well, let me give you just one little passage on the ball itself, and then about its aftermath, the ball's aftermath. She's looking around. Their coats, better cut, seem made of suppler cloth, and their hair, brought forward in curls at their temples, glazed by finer pomades than she would find in her little town. They had, she says, they had the complexion of wealth. They had the complexion of wealth, that white skin which is set off by the pallor of porcelain, the shimmer of satin, the finish of handsome furniture, and which is maintained in its health by a prudent regimen of exquisite foods. Their necks turned comfortably in low cravats, their long side whiskers rested upon downturned collars. They wiped their lips on handkerchiefs embroidered with large monograms and redolent of a pleasing scent, perfumed handkerchiefs. Those who were beginning to age had a youthful look, while a touch of maturity overlay the faces of the younger. In their indifferent gazes floated the tranquility of passions daily gratified. And beneath their gentle manners was visible that particular brutality imparted by domination in rather easy things, in which one's strength is exerted and one's vanity tickled, the handling of thoroughbred horses and the company of fallen women. See you next time.